Welcome to WizeUp. I'm Paul Arthur. I want to talk today about parental rights in Alberta and in Canada, especially as it relates to transgender issues. These issues continue. Most of you know the Alberta government recently passed some legislation on this topic, and it's getting some support and also some pushback for sure. And so I want to talk about it today with a couple of people who have a vested interest in this from their own personal lives. So joining me today from Calgary is Jojo Ruba. He's a Christian apologist, and he's also the executive director of Redeeming Conversations. And also joining us is Faith Groleau, who is a detransitioner. And so that's a biological female. She identified as male and has since detransitioned back to female. Okay, so we're going to hear some of her story today, some of JoJo's story as well. Why don't we first start with just tell us a bit about Redeeming Conversations. What's your group all about?
Yeah, Paul, thanks for being here. Thanks for having us. Redeeming Conversations is a Christian apologetics ministry that really focuses on helping Christians be effective in everyday conversations, because we believe there is so much that we can share that's good news that we can talk about. And a lot of times as Christians, we don't actually focus on the everyday life and the everyday conversations we can have with our friends and family. And probably the number one challenge in terms of conversations for Christian Canadians is on the topic of LGBTQ. So that's why this has been such a big issue for us to do training on.
Okay, and I know you do some work together with parentsandkidstogether.ca, so there's another website that's actually helpful in this whole conversation here. So parentsandkidstogether.ca. So Faith, do you want to share a little bit about where you're at here in your journey? Yeah.
Absolutely. So I was transitioned, medicalized when I should not have been. I was misdiagnosed as transgender and essentially allowed to just diagnose myself. I was put under an affirmation only model, and so the doctors didn't really question why I thought I was trans. They just let me think I was, didn't really give any pushback. Any other symptoms that I had was passed off as being part of being trans. So I was given puberty blockers and testosterone. I was approved for top surgery, but I did not go through with it. I let that expire. And then a few years down the line, I ended up realizing some information came out about the whole procedure that they go through. And that showed me that I was transitioned when I should not have been. It was incorrectly done. They didn't follow any of the guidelines, essentially, that were in place correctly, and so I started to detransition myself, again, with no medical follow-up from the people who started the process for varying reasons. But eventually I detransitioned, realized I was a woman still and could not be a man. Like, I was aware of that the whole time, but now they're pushing the idea that that's untrue. So...
Okay, so you've got some regrets, and we
Absolutely.
hardly ever hear, at least in mainstream media, about someone who's transitioned to go back to detransition with some regrets and some medical reasons for that as well. We'll come back to that in a bit here. So Faith, I don't know if you saw this article, or Jojo. This is in the National Post, and I think it ties in. I saw this article and I thought, wow, okay, a recent study paper. And it was published in the Canadian Pediatric Society's journal. And in this article, they advised doctors to support affirming gender questioning 6-year-olds. Now, in response, though, a number of pediatricians are expressing concern about this report, and I'm really glad to hear that they're speaking out. They say if parents simply affirm their child's expressed gender, without asking any questions, they actually risk harming their child. And so you touched base on that there, Faith, that this was just, kind of no questions asked, in this case not from your parents, but from the medical doctor. And just, the only answer we have is to just affirm whatever you feel you're going through and go from there. But that didn't work out so well for yourself.
No. And that's the thing as well. My mother did actually ask questions, and the doctors essentially had to convince her that everything was fine and it was okay to do this. She did ask questions, but they just brushed it off as it was no big deal. It was fine. Surgery, no big deal for a 17, 18-year-old. And now apparently 6-year-olds, we're going to just bring them on that pathway. Um, that just seems
Yeah,
absurd to
that's
me. And the fact that parents aren't even allowed to ask questions now for fear that their kids are going to be taken away for that because they're being transphobic and not affirming it.
well. Does this tie in? I know. I remember a few years back. I think it was Bill C4, the anti-conversion therapy bill, raised a lot of ruckus across Canada, but it got passed. So now it's illegal, if I remember correctly, for a doctor or a psychologist or a pastor or a counselor to advise somebody, or give advice essentially. Let's say if they want to change their sexual identity or their gender, and you advise against it for whatever concerns you might have, that's now illegal. So does this affect you as well, Faith?
Yes. So because the doctors were not allowed to question me, they couldn't question why I felt that way. They couldn't advise me to wait because that would have been against that bill. They were not able to provide proper holistic health care because they weren't allowed to look at every aspect of me. The fact that I said, I think I'm trans, they had to follow the affirming model only because otherwise they could lose their license, right? But apparently it's gender affirming to cut off perfectly healthy body parts because a child says they feel like it. You know, give them
That's
drugs that they can
concerning.
never recover for.
Um,
I am
okay.
now experiencing pain several years later after stopping the medications, and doctors don't know what to do with me because they don't know what it was that caused the problem. So, and that was several
Yeah.
years of misdiagnoses because I was fast tracked down this one lane for literally no other reason other than I said I felt a certain way. And even with all of these other warning signs, they still just fast tracked me anyway instead of slowing the process down. And that's what they're there for, is they're supposed to be the gatekeepers of safeguarding the children who may grow out of it, which I did, you know.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I have seen the stats on that. I think it's 80% plus
Yeah.
of children, struggling with gender identity. Later simply go back to their, biological self, and everything's good. Jojo, any thoughts on this? Again, especially with the anti-conversion therapy bill here and how it's impacting real people today and it's impacting their health.
Well, I think it's critically important to point out that Faith's story is not the only story. And she has other friends. There's actually a Detrans Alliance of Canada that's just been formed. The problem is these statistics that the study shows, and people who promote transitioning 6-year-olds don't actually look at the people affected. So, for example, in the study, it says that after 5 years, children who've transitioned are still really happy about their transition. But people who actually study this long term, like my friend Walt Heyer, who runs a website helping hundreds of transitioners or detransitioners every year, says it takes about 8 to 10 years before people begin to regret their transition and realize it did not fix their gender dysphoria. And let me just explain a few of those words. So gender dysphoria is the feeling that you have that you're disconnected from your body. Your biological gender is separate from how you feel about yourself, how you see yourself in terms of gender. And I think, as particularly for parents and teachers, pastors, Christians, and the general society, it's that principle I think is the most problematic, that we can create an identity apart from our biology that is based solely on intense, very strong, very real, but there's still very much feelings. And I think Faith is absolutely right here. You need good psychological counseling and support to make sure that you can be assessed properly so that you understand what you're actually doing. Children don't know at 6 years old that they're going to be sterilized for the rest of their life, that they're going to be taking medication for the rest of their life, that they will face osteoporosis and other medical conditions. Or in one case, Faith, maybe you can talk about one of your friends who may also lose an arm because she transitioned to being male. So these are the kinds of stories that the conversion therapy ban prevents from preventing, because it actually prevents teachers, pastors, parents from helping their kids simply accept their biological identity and reject the notion that their feelings are more important than their biology. That's the danger of the law. That's what we said would happen when
Yeah.
this was passed 4 or 5 years ago. And guess what, Paul? Not one person has been charged or convicted under those laws.
Yeah, that's again concerning, and we are seeing certainly in the UK and now in the US as well. I believe it's beginning some lawsuits against, some of these medical corporations or groups that have been promoting really, trans surgeries and so forth and puberty blockers, and of course not informing their clients of the potential risks. And they should get sued, frankly. I'm hoping that'll wake people up that this impacts people in a very real way. So Faith, I know before we started doing the interview here, you were mentioning that you yourself had a lot of underlying mental health issues. And from the studies I've seen here as well, there's multiple studies that indicate that in fact is quite common among trans kids, is that there are underlying mental health issues that really need to be at least investigated to see if this is part of the issue, and so is the transitioning actually necessary or not, right? And so in your case, you had two different doctors, as I guess a psychologist and then a medical doctor. And the medical doctor apparently did not actually somehow communicate properly with the information from the psychologist there. I don't know, and it didn't get factored in, right?
Correct, yeah. So there was a therapist I was working with. We had been working for several years on several different mental health disorders, getting those diagnosed and treating them. When I went to this medical doctor, she was a pediatrician who had somehow apparently trained herself in transgender medicine. And she was essentially there to vet me properly to say whether or not I was actually trans or not, and to decide whether I would go through the medical path with an endocrinologist or whether I would just take the time to wait. I was about 17 when we started really getting into the medication, and they met with me several times alone and kept my mom basically in the dark. She just stayed in the waiting room unless I allowed her in the room. And at the time, I didn't have a great relationship with my mom, so she wasn't allowed in the room. And that's what they're doing now in schools as well, or they were trying to, where they were trying to put that wall up between the parents and the kids and say, no, you don't have to tell your parents. It's okay. It'll be between us. It's like, no, that's not what they're there for. And that's not what the doctor's there for either. But that's how they worked. That's how they ran it. They were a wall between me and my mom. And they stood there and essentially convinced her that all of this was okay, that nothing bad was going to happen. I mean, they have to put in, like, in the warnings, they say, like, oh, heart attack, risk of death, liver problems. Maybe I don't even think they put liver problems, actually. But that is something that we're seeing is a problem that we're not warned about. But again, they put all of these issues on and they just kind of brush over it like it's Tylenol. Like, if you take too many, sure. But, regular use of it is fine as long as you're doing it properly with the doctor's recommendation.
Yeah.
But if you're injecting synthetic testosterone into a natal female's body, the body is not built to receive that. And especially if you're doing it in the middle of puberty, which is what they did with me, which if you even look at the policy, I'm not supposed to have gotten it. Puberty blockers are given before you start puberty. I was 17. I had already started puberty. I was right in the middle of it. I had a menstrual cycle that was well developed. I was going. And they gave me puberty blockers anyway, right in the middle of it. You're not supposed to do that.
So are you actually suing the doctors involved, or are you doing anything about that? Because, it doesn't sound like things were handled properly, and of course it affected you negatively here.
No, so what happens is there is a College of Physicians and Surgeons. That's essentially where every doctor has to be certified by them.
Yep.
So I applied and made a claim with them, and they are protecting the doctors, saying that nothing was done wrong. Even though I
Right.
gave them access to
Okay.
my medical records, which I also have the same access to the same medical records, um, which is where I get my information of she did know, even though during this investigation she said she didn't.
Right.
So then there's another level above that where the College of Physicians
Okay.
and Surgeons says the doctors did nothing wrong, we're not taking any further action. I'm able to go a step further with the
Okay.
Health Professionals Association Committee. There's some acronym
Right,
there.
yeah. So, but you've got to go through a lot of hoops, a
Yeah,
lot of time,
yeah,
effort, and of course, if you get lawyers involved and there's all kinds of money involved, it makes it
exactly.
discouraging, I guess, to get to the bottom of this and to get some justice, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. That's discouraging to hear.
Hmm.
I'm just looking at the clock here, and I make sure we actually get to touch on this. We had mentioned the Alberta laws that were passed here. And you mentioned about your parents there, your mom not being allowed into the room. So that's concerning. I believe this is Bill 26 that did get passed, right? Protecting, or is it? No, it's actually Bill 27, I think, right? That ensures parents that are involved in every decision of their child. So and that's getting some pushback, right, from special interest groups and so forth. And so, what's their concern? I mean, and I've heard it before. I think it's basically they're saying, well, if you force your, I guess the youth to get outed, if you will, to their parents, whether it's a sexual identity or gender identity sort of thing being changed. They're concerned that the parents are somehow going to harm their own kids or reject them or cause some kind of difficulties. Is there evidence to back that up?
Well, in terms of the law, Paul, I guess I had a strange conversation with my MLA, who was an NDP, and we presented the facts. Faith was actually there, shared her story that she actually wanted her mom, like most kids do, to
Mm.
be there. And this NDP MLA said, "I don't care basically about what you said. I'm going to vote against this." And it was really an ideological move from people who are virtue signaling on this topic and not actually looking at what the facts actually state. First of all, there's
Mm.
already laws protecting kids from abusive parents or guardians. Those laws are in place, and teachers who know that or suspect that a student is being abused have a right to withhold information or to report that parent to the police if there's an issue such as that. But the vast majority of children, we're talking about 6-year-olds now, not just 17-year-olds, are best protected when parents are involved in their life. Parents are the ones who are most invested in the lives of their children, both genetically, financially, morally, spiritually.
Yeah.
It makes perfect sense to empower parents to know what's going on in their children's lives. And
Yeah.
if there is abuse or danger there, that's when the government steps in.
And often, as you point out, Faith, you actually did want your mom to be there with you. Apparently there is one exception here. I know, again, the bill got passed, which I'm glad to see in Alberta. But did I see this correctly that GSAs, so Gay Straight Alliance clubs in Alberta, are exempt from that? In other words,
Feel
you
exempt.
can you can have them teach your kids whatever they want, and there's no way the parents can be notified about this?
You can have anyone, not just anything, teach at a GSA. So I've heard of a pastor coming in to a GSA in a school in Lethbridge who was promoting the idea that biblical Christianity supports LGBTQ
Oh, wow.
practices. And so that was contrary to the religious beliefs of many of the people in that group. And they're not
Hmm.
supposed to be teaching religion. There's another speaker who was promoting the NDP at that GSA. Again,
Hmm.
they're not supposed to be partisan, and yet there they were. I think what's important here is that Albertans need to know these laws have not been put in place yet because they're being taken to court or in the middle of the court process already.
Ah.
So we need to make sure as Albertans to vote, especially this federal election, because these are the kinds of issues where the government is going to continue to censor and stop the kind of support people like Faith need. And in order to
Okay.
make sure that more people are not affected like Faith, and the stories are just starting to come out, we need to make sure we vote against these kinds of legislation or thinking.
Okay, so don't stop visiting your MLAs and your members of parliament. Faith, I haven't heard, at least I don't think, any of the federal, political leaders bring up the trans issue at all or gender identity issues in this. Have you?
Maxime Bernier had brought it up.
Right.
He was
Okay.
walking around. There was a video of him with one of the books that they were trying to allow in the schools, and he was questioning it.
Yes.
Anybody else that has said anything about it usually is very flippant, like it's like they're just saying it to say it to gain points. I don't know if they'll actually do
Right.
anything about it because nobody really understands it and they're not entirely willing to educate themselves on it because they have to go digging. Because unfortunately, people have been speaking out about it for at least the past 10 years. It's just the fact that they get silenced and they just get brushed aside and people call them transphobic. They're just
Yeah.
brushed off because people think that they're just upset. And it's like, no, there are serious physical concerns with what's happening with the adults who are making these decisions. And
Right.
you want to allow a 6-year-old who can't even figure out its own bedtime or what to eat for dinner because it wants ice cream, and you're going to let it pick a gender that leads it
Yeah.
down a full lifetime medicalization that it has absolutely no way of agreeing to because our brains aren't fully developed until we're 25. And God forbid you do any sort of substance like heroin, cocaine,
Yeah.
marijuana. If you take a puberty blocker or if you take testosterone or synthetic estrogen in the middle of that developmental period, your brain's not going to fully develop at 25. It's going to take longer to do that, and you may have done permanent damage, but we don't get to see that because
Right.
these are the
Yeah.
trials, unfortunately. They don't have any
Okay.
information to go off of. Any long term studies are literally showing it's physically harmful to these kids to affirm this.
Yeah, the CAS
You know,
study was quite interesting, and I know
yes.
anytime a study like that comes out, it's going to get some pushback as well. But again,
Yep.
showing that man, that just going ahead to a gender affirming treatment, there's just a complete lack of evidence to support that as being something that's helpful, generally speaking. So,
Yeah.
Yeah, if I could
yeah,
just point out,
yeah,
Finland, the UK, Sweden, these are not Bible believing conservative states in the
yeah,
US.
that's right for sure.
These are very liberal countries in
Yeah.
Europe are reducing or actually outright banning child transitioning.
Mhm.
These are the kinds of progressive nations that have been experiencing this for a very long time. Canada is risking its own peril by allowing for this to happen when the facts are already in place. We're ripe for lawsuits.
Oh yeah, they'll be coming, I think,
Mhm.
and they should be. Frankly, we need to protect our children here. So, what do the surveys say here? Like, I guess I'm just thinking to myself, why aren't we, you know, responding similarly as Finland and the UK and so forth, and saying, hey, we got to stop this, and. Again, we're seeing papers like this coming out encouraging pediatricians to just use the gender affirming process, no questions asked. So, what do the polls tell us? What do the average Canadians think about this?
Well, if I could just chime in here, the average Albertans, because that's the only polls I've seen so far, are
Okay.
very much supportive of parental rights. And they reflect the fact that parents are either very concerned or concerned that they should be involved in any kind of medicalization of their children. So these are high numbers, 70 to 80% altogether, if you include the very and the quite concerned. In terms of people actually understanding what's at stake, I think Trump has done, whether you like him or not, has done a good job
Yep.
putting the agenda on the topic on the agenda of most people, most parents, and they're realizing, this is actually something we ought to care about. We ought to be very concerned about. Throw in the other bill that Alberta has passed about women and women's sports, that biological women have a right to participate in sports with other biological women and not biological males. These are very foundational to the lives of ordinary Albertans. And I think if we actually had a fair discussion where these medical communities, like the study that was reported in the National Post, did not mention the CAST report, did not look at contrary studies that Faith mentioned, that's actually coming out from other parts of the world that show that this is not something that will help kids, I think the polling numbers will follow.
Yeah, wow. Okay, what would you like to see happen in this federal election? I guess what would you, if you could have the ear of the federal leaders here, what would you ask them for, Faith?
To protect the children from adults who seem to have some form of incentive to not give them proper health care. Their Hippocratic oath starts with do no harm.
Right.
That is the oath you take as a physician, as a nurse, as any sort of medical professional. So the moment you are not informing someone, a patient, of the risks of some form of procedure that they think they might need, you are intentionally harming them because you are not giving them the chance to give you the informed consent. You're not giving them all of the information.
Yeah.
That is not informed consent if they don't have all of the information.
I mean, that makes sense, what you just said there, Faith. Yeah. Jojo, your final thoughts here on this?
You know, it's frustrating because people want to stay outside of this picture. They don't want to think of it deeply. But the problem is, and I just was speaking in Ontario this weekend to a Christian group, and they had people there whose family members have begun to transition or start thinking about transitioning.
Well, 20
so
seconds.
these are the kinds of conversations we must have in the church. And that's why it's critical for us to talk about this openly, to love our LGBTQ neighbors enough to be able to speak frankly and truthfully without censorship, and to know that speaking truth is not unloving. Hiding truth is unloving.
Very well said. The conversation needs to happen, and just be frank but kind. Thank you so much, guys. Faith Groleau, detransitioner, and Jojo Ruba, again, the Executive Director of Redeeming Conversations. We're just mentioning that. They need to be redeeming. All right. Thanks for watching. Appreciate it. WizeUp.ca is our website. Email me, Paul, at WizeUp.ca with any thoughts. And don't forget to hit subscribe.